They were not flying into enemy territory. There were no reported fighters in the area. The weather was calm. Visibility was clear. This was supposed to be one of the safest parts of the mission. But somewhere over the dark waters of the North Sea, a World War II bomber disappeared without warning. There was no distress call. No explosion was seen. No wreckage was ever confirmed. The aircraft simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but silence. For the crew aboard that bomber, the war did not end in battle. It ended quietly, far from witnesses, far from help, and far from home. This is the story of a mission that was never meant to fail, and a crew that never returned. By 1944, the air war over Europe had reached its most intense phase. Allied bomber crews flew thousands of missions, often facing overwhelming danger. Enemy fighters, anti-aircraft fire, mechanical failure, and harsh weather all competed to claim lives in the sky. Yet among all these dangers, many airmen feared one place more than any other: the sea. The North Sea was a vast, cold expanse that separated Britain from occupied Europe. It was crossed daily by bombers heading to and from their targets. If an aircraft went down over land, there was at least a chance of survival or capture. But if it went down into the sea, survival time was measured in minutes. Cold water shock, freezing temperatures, rough waves. For bomber crews, the sea offered almost no mercy. The aircraft assigned to this mission was a long-range bomber designed for endurance rather than speed. It was heavily loaded, carrying fuel, equipment, and defensive armament. Its survival depended not on agility, but on careful navigation, coordination, and discipline. Inside the aircraft, conditions were harsh. The roar of engines never stopped. Temperatures at altitude dropped far below freezing. Crew members wore heavy flight gear, oxygen masks, and gloves just to function. Every man aboard had a role that mattered. The pilot controlled the aircraft. The navigator calculated the route. The wireless operator maintained contact. The gunners watched the sky. They relied on one another completely. The crew were young, most barely in their 20s. Some had already completed several missions. Others were still adjusting to the reality of combat flying. Despite the danger, they shared a sense of routine. Missions began to blur together, each one following the same procedures. Before takeoff, there were no reports of tension or concern. No mechanical complaints were filed. Ground crews later stated that the aircraft appeared fully operational. To command, it was just another scheduled mission. To the men aboard, it was another flight they believed they would survive. The mission required the bomber to cross a long stretch of the North Sea before turning toward its operational objective. This crossing was considered routine. Weather forecasts showed no major storms. Winds were within acceptable limits. As the aircraft climbed to cruising altitude, communication with ground stations was normal. Position reports were transmitted as expected. Everything appeared to be proceeding according to plan. Then, without warning, the radio went silent. The final transmission from the bomber was brief and unremarkable. There was no urgency in the voice, no indication of danger, no request for assistance. Moments later, all contact was lost. Ground stations attempted to re-establish communication. Other aircraft flying nearby reported no visual signs of trouble. No explosion was seen. No emergency signals were detected. The bomber had vanished. Search efforts began quickly. Aircraft were dispatched to the last known coordinates. Naval patrols scanned the waters below. Crews searched for oil slicks, debris, or parachutes. Nothing was found. Hours turned into days, Days turned into weeks. No confirmed wreckage was ever recovered. The sea remained silent. As time passed, questions began to emerge. How could an aircraft disappear so completely in an area that was heavily traveled? Why was there no distress call? Why were there no floating remains? Several theories were proposed. One possibility was sudden mechanical failure. An engine fire or structural failure at altitude could destroy an aircraft before the crew had time to respond. In such cases, debris could scatter widely, making discovery difficult. Another theory involved navigation error. Even experienced crews could be affected by wind drift and instrument limitations. A small mistake could push an aircraft far off course, leading it into remote waters. There were also reports from fishermen weeks later who claimed to have seen floating debris or heard distant explosions. None of these reports could be verified. Without physical evidence, no theory could be confirmed. For the families of the crew, the uncertainty was devastating. There were no remains to bury, no confirmed explanation, only a notice declaring their loved ones missing in action. Some families held on to hope for years. Others were forced to accept that answers might never come. Letters stopped arriving. Promises made before departure were never fulfilled. The war continued. The world moved forward. But for them, time stood still. The ghost bomber of the North Sea represents more than a single missing aircraft. It represents the countless airmen whose stories were never fully recorded. Missions that ended quietly. Losses that occurred without witnesses. History often focuses on victories and defeats, but between those moments lie stories of silence, uncertainty, and sacrifice. These men did not fail. They flew because they were asked to. They accepted the risks of a war that demanded everything from those who fought it. Their disappearance was not the result of weakness, but the reality of wartime aviation. Somewhere beneath the cold waters of the North Sea, the truth may still exist. A fragment of metal, a forgotten wreck, a final clue waiting to be discovered, or perhaps it will remain lost forever. And that too is part of history, because not every story ends with answers. Some end with silence. The ghost bomber of the North Sea never returned. Its crew never came home. But as long as their story is told, they are not forgotten. The wind that night did not sound natural. It did not move like ordinary winter air across broken buildings and frozen ground. It carried something heavier, something that felt almost deliberate. Inside the dimly lit command shelter beneath the snow-covered forest near the Eastern Front, Colonel Reinhardt studied the decoded fragments again and again, as if the paper itself might confess its secrets under enough pressure. The transmission was incomplete, yet it was enough to disturb a man who had seen cities burn and battalions erased in hours. The coordinates referenced a location that did not officially exist on any map issued by the High Command. A blank zone, an absence. And in war, absences were often more dangerous than enemies. Reinhardt had learned long ago that the most terrifying operations were not the loud offensives with tanks and artillery. They were the quiet ones, the ones buried in coded language and redirected supply routes, the kind of missions where entire units vanished from official records, their names quietly struck from paper as if they had never breathed. And now, this message suggested that such an operation had been reactivated. Not in Berlin, not under the public eye of the Reich's Strategic Council, but here, near the frozen forests where visibility died after sunset. He summoned Captain Adler, a man younger but hardened by relentless winters and retreat lines that never stopped shifting. Adler entered with boots still dusted in frost, saluting sharply, but Reinhardt noticed the hesitation, the faintest flicker in his eyes. News traveled in whispers long before it was spoken aloud. Soldiers had begun reporting strange mechanical sounds deep within the woods at night. Not tank engines, not artillery repositioning, something else. A low rhythmic vibration that seemed to pulse beneath the earth itself. Reinhardt handed him the coordinates without explanation. Adler studied them for several seconds. Then his jaw tightened. "Sir, that sector was evacuated months ago." "So I was told," Reinhardt replied quietly. But evacuation orders did not align with supply shipments recorded last week. Fuel, medical crates, reinforced steel components. The kind used in underground construction. Someone had built something in secret, and not recently. By morning, a reconnaissance team was assembled. 5 men. No insignia beyond standard field markings. Officially, they were reassigned to artillery calibration support. Unofficially, their existence for the next 48 hours would not be acknowledged. Reinhardt watched them disappear into the white horizon, black silhouettes swallowed by drifting snow. What none of them knew, what perhaps even High Command did not fully understand, was that this region had once been selected for a classified research initiative before the war expanded beyond control. The project had been shelved, then resurrected as desperation grew. And desperation in 1944 was no longer a rumor. It was visible in every retreating convoy, every fuel ration cut in half, every telegram stamped urgent. The forest grew unnaturally silent as the team advanced deeper. Birds had abandoned the area. Even the wind felt constrained, as if trapped beneath the canopy. Private Keller, the youngest among them, later described in his recovered field notes that the ground felt hollow in places, like walking over a buried structure. They found the entrance at dusk. It was not marked with flags or guards. Instead, it was concealed beneath a reinforced steel hatch, camouflaged with snow and branches. No tracks surrounded it, yet the snow was slightly melted at its edges, as if heat escaped from below. Adler knelt and brushed aside frost, revealing fresh weld lines, recently sealed. He signaled for silence. Then came the sound again, clearer now. A deep mechanical hum pulsing at consistent intervals. Not random, not broken machinery. Something operational. They did not have authorization to open it, but in war, hesitation often killed faster than bullets. Adler ordered the hatch pried open. The first wave of air that escaped was warm and metallic. Not the smell of fuel, not oil, something sharper, sterile, artificial, electric. A ladder descended into darkness, lit faintly by emergency red lights below, and against protocol, against common sense, they went down. The underground chamber stretched far larger than any of them expected. Concrete walls reinforced with steel ribs curved outward into multiple corridors. Heavy cables ran along ceilings. Banks of machinery lined the central hall, their surfaces vibrating with contained energy. But what froze Adler in place was not the equipment. It was the uniforms. Hanging neatly along one wall were officer coats bearing insignia from divisions officially declared destroyed months earlier. Entire units that had fallen in Stalingrad. Commanders reported dead, medals awarded posthumously, yet their personal effects were here. Operational, preserved. Private Keller whispered something under his breath that no one responded to. Then lights flickered. Footsteps echoed from the corridor ahead. Not frantic, not surprised, measured, deliberate. A man emerged wearing a research coat, not a military uniform. His face was pale, eyes exhausted but alert. He did not raise a weapon. He did not appear shocked. Instead, he studied them as though they were the unexpected variable. "You were not scheduled," he said calmly. Adler demanded identification, authority, clearance codes. The man smiled faintly. "Authorization no longer applies. The war above is collapsing faster than projected. We have accelerated Phase 3. That phrase meant nothing to the soldiers, yet everything in his tone suggested inevitability. Before Adler could press further, the hum intensified. Lights brightened. Somewhere deeper in the complex, massive turbines began rotating at higher velocity. The floor vibrated subtly beneath their boots. The researcher turned toward the corridor. "You should leave," he said quietly. "You are never meant to witness activation." Activation, the word echoed in the chamber like a verdict. Suddenly, alarms erupted, not emergency sirens but synchronization tones. Rhythmic pulses aligned with the machinery's hum, panels along the walls illuminated with unfamiliar symbols, not standard German engineering markings, something experimental. Private Keller stepped backward. "What is this place?" he whispered. The researcher hesitated, and for the first time, uncertainty crossed his face. "It is an attempt," he said, "to change the outcome." Above ground, miles away, Colonel Reinhardt felt the tremor before he heard it. Instruments on his desk vibrated. Snow dislodged from shelter rooftops. The horizon flickered briefly, not with artillery fire, but with a strange distortion of light. Within the underground chamber, power surged to its peak, and in that moment, every man present understood one terrifying possibility. This was not a weapon designed to destroy the enemy. It was designed to alter something far more fundamental. Time, history, outcome. Whether it would succeed or unleash consequences no strategist could predict, was no longer a theoretical debate, because Phase 3 had begun. And above the forest, the sky itself seemed to hesitate.